everyone, welcome to the second screencast for our week this week. Hopefully you just finished, or before you watched this one you finished, the screencast differentiating between our self, our personality, and our identity, so that we know the difference between all of these. Now we come into our material for this week, really understanding which piece of the puzzle that is us we are diving into whenever we are talking about the self. The self has impacts on how we communicate, how we understand who we are, and how we act in our relationships. And so, what we're going to do for the rest of our screen time this week, with me anyway, is we are going to dive into some of the high points of the chapter. There is more in the chapter than I can cover in 1 week. Okay. I would probably have to make 3 hours of screencasts to get there, all right? And I'm not going to do that. You're welcome, okay? And you're welcome to self, because that's a lot. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hit some of the high points that I think you need to make sure you understand these concepts so that you can go into our discussions for this week knowing where you're at and understanding the terms to discuss them and really dig in. Okay, so let's talk about the self. Let's dive in, okay? Now, we have already defined the self a few ways in our previous screencast, but I'm going to reiterate some of this, okay? So the definition from our text defines the self as an evolving composite of self-awareness, self-concept, and self-esteem, okay? I said it differently here so that we can capture it and then dive into each piece, okay? So the self is an evolving composite of 3 components. I mentioned what the 3 components are that develop continually over time. So the self is continuing to develop over time, okay? All of us does that, and by all of us I mean all of us, each piece of us does that, but the self is the piece that is more on the nurture side, if you'll remember. So based on life experience. Our life experiences will help us grow and change in this in each of these few areas we're about to talk about. Okay, so the first piece, and we've talked a little bit about this in the last screencast, is self-awareness. Okay, now I'm going to bring in some other concepts here, and our text talks about it in a very specific way. I'm going to try to augment the way our text talks about this with some other concepts to help it be clearer. Okay, so self-awareness, here we go. We have defined this, but here it is again. The ability to view yourself as a unique person and to reflect on your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. In the last screencast I said, we have the ability to think about our thoughts. We have the ability to reflect on our being, and that is self-awareness. And then the way that this links to the self is not just the awareness, but what the awareness leads to. In the previous screencast, we talked about how we have these questions that we ask, and the answers to those questions are our self-concept and our self-esteem. Well, what happens is you have self-awareness, and you begin to exist and be in the world, and you cannot help but do social comparison. So what happens is this. We exist in the world with other people, and over time, we observe and we assign meaning to the behavior of others, and then we compare it with our own. It's the only way for us to understand how we fit or don't fit. Whatever feelings you have about fit or not fitting, you used social comparison to get there. And now, this is a little bit different than the conversation that's out there that says you shouldn't compare yourself to others. There is some truth to that. You should not compare yourself to others, especially when it's an unfair comparison. When, one of the things I am bad about when it comes to that is I look at what other people have achieved by the time they're my age, and it just is depressing, because I would find these examples of people who had, done crazy things by the time they were my age, whatever age it was. And that is bad comparison. Now, there is good comparison. You need a good example to compare yourself against, and so that's that conversation. This just means that when I am existing in my life, whenever I am growing up, whenever I am even now as an adult, I observe my behavior and I assign that meaning to others' behavior and I compare it with my own to know, oh, okay, wow, am I talking too much in this meeting? Am I, talking too loudly sometimes? It can also be, social comparison is how you know. I can ask you questions about yourself, you can answer it. So like if I ask this, I use this in the last screencast, I'll use it again. If I ask you, are you tall? You could probably give me an answer. And your answer would have required you to use social comparison to even come up with the answer. Tall is relative. And so are you tall? Yes or no? There's nothing you can do about it. It's not your fault, right? Wherever you are. But we use social comparison to understand ourselves, okay? So not all comparison is bad. In fact, we rely on comparison to know if our behavior is good, to know if our communication is working, to know how we fit or don't fit, okay? So self-awareness leads us to social comparison, okay? Social comparison leads to the development of the self-concept, okay? So remember, we're talking about the self being made of three things. Self-awareness, self-concept is number two. Here we are, okay? So, I've said this before as well, self-concept. Overall perception of who you are, based on beliefs, values, attitudes you have about yourself, okay? So your book goes into a little more depth here, and then I've put another term in with this to help us understand, okay? So your book references what's known in the research as the looking glass self. Your self-concept as shaped by what you believe others think of you. So in essence, you seeing yourself through the lens of someone else. That's the looking glass self. My self-concept as shaped by what I think other people think of me. Okay? And this is extremely powerful. It sounds like we are relying too much, especially in our individualistic selves, it sounds like we are relying too much on the judgments of others to determine my self-concept. And in some cases we are. But we actually have to have this on some level, okay? And so another way of looking at this is what's called reflected appraisal, all right? This is not in your textbook. So reflected appraisal and the looking glass self are basically the same thing here, okay? So reflected appraisal is your perceptions of the judgments of those around you, the ways others' messages shape your self-concept. So reflected appraisal, imagine this, okay? Imagine that this piece of paper is a mirror, okay? And on this side, it reflects, and on the back side, it's also a mirror, okay? It's not like I can see through it, but it's a mirror on both sides, okay? So imagine every single person on the face of the planet that you have ever interacted with carries around a mirror, okay? I've got mine, you've got yours, and here we are, okay? So what happens is I actually see my reflection in the piece of paper you are holding. Does that make sense? So I am seeing my reflection, but from your mirror. That's reflected appraisal. That's the looking glass self, okay? I see that. And so whatever I'm getting back from you is reflected appraisal. I then take that back into consideration with social comparison, okay? And it's this cycle, and this is why the self is constantly changing, okay? I consistently and throughout my days, I am getting reflected appraisal, okay? Now, there are significant others in this, and it's like, oh, okay. There are people whose evaluations are especially influential. So it's one thing for me to just be walking down the street and I see my reflection in everybody's mirror, okay? I see that there, I get that information and I use it, but really the important thing is that there are people in my lives whose whatever reflection they send back to me matters more. So who are the significant others and what reflections are they putting back to you? We're going to talk about discrepancy theory here in a minute. We're going to talk about a few reasons that you need good significant others. And I'm not just talking about romantic relationships here. I'm talking about people whose evaluations are influential in your life, okay? So far, we've got self-awareness. We've got self-concept, okay? So self-awareness, being aware. Self-concept, relatively stable set of perception of myself, okay? Then we get to self-esteem. Now, I think I said in the last screencast that we tend to use self-concept and self-esteem and personality, self-identity all sort of interchangeably, it seems like. So self-esteem, though, is not the same thing as self-concept. Self-esteem is the value we assign to ourselves, okay? I know I defined this last time. I'm not going to spend forever on it, all right? What I do want to do is I want to dive into what self-esteem can mean in the ways we communicate, in the ways we behave. So let's do this. Let's talk about low self-esteem for a minute, okay? So your book has this really great figure where it talks about how self-esteem can repeat itself. And it's true, okay? So this cycle here is pretty good. You have a negative belief about yourself, let's just say. I'm stupid and unattractive. I hope none of you believe that, but as far as I know, just about every person I've ever known has had that thought, that belief about themselves at one point. It might have been fleeting, it might have been quick, but a lot of people have had that, okay? So you have the negative belief about yourself, okay? This is actually self-concept stuff. I am stupid and unattractive. How do I feel about being stupid and unattractive? So this is not the self-esteem statement. This is the self-concept statement. Remember, this is a belief about yourself. Remember we said self-concept, made up of the attitudes, beliefs, and values and perceptions that we have of ourselves. You have the perception. You attach value to the perception. This is the self-esteem part. I hate myself. Or I feel so unattractive that, I hate my appearance or whatever. But these two together here saying I hate myself is probably a pretty good jump here. Why do I hate myself? And it just repeats itself because I'm stupid and unattractive, right? So one, and take a look at this. This is just like one bad self-concept statement. One assessment of value. And look what that can do. Think about how many of these you actually have. Think about how many self-concept statements you actually have that make up you. How many self-esteem statements we have that make us up. It is insane how much there is there, okay? And folks, high or low self-esteem has a powerful effect on communication behavior. If you begin to feel that these things about you really are true, that cycle begins to repeat itself like this, it will impact how you communicate with yourself and with other people. That in turn impacts yourself. I mean, it's all a big cycle, not just the self-esteem, self-concept cycle, but having the thing in your self-concept, having the self-esteem statement, how that impacts your communication, how that impacts your relationships, how that then comes back and forms yourself. And so this is the short version for some of this is just baggage, right? You meet somebody and the baggage they carry can sometimes be all of this. Now, this is not meant to be discouraging, but it may sound that way. The tendency to resist our self-perception is strong. If I believe I'm stupid and unattractive, it's hard for me to pull myself out of that, okay? So, once a communicator fastens onto a self-concept, the tendency is to seek out people who actually confirm that perception about myself, okay? So, what we have to do is we have to pay attention to not just the beliefs we have about ourselves, but the behaviors that it might be causing us to do. And are there things in our lives that we're actually sort of self-sabotaging on just because it confirms the self-concept and self-esteem that we have already assigned to ourselves? This can be pretty powerful stuff when you really start to think about, oh, maybe I've surrounded myself with people who confirm my self-esteem rather than people who actually have good, nice things to say about me, right? So I am going to pause before we finish up self-esteem. I'll see you in the next screencast.